Welcome back to another Tactical Fly Fisher video. I am Devin Olson, the owner of Tactical Fly Fisher and your host for this rod review. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Hardy Ultralite LL series of rods. The Ultralite LL isn't exactly a new series of rods. They've been out since I think 2020 if I remember right. I'll be completely honest, for the first little while I didn't really pay all that much attention to them. They came out about a year after the Contact 2 series, and so I had already switched over a lot of my Euro nymphing rods to the Contact 2, and so when the Hardy Ultralite LLs came out, I wasn't really, ready to add a whole bunch of new rods to my collection. So I compared them with some flex tests at the time, found that they were fairly similar in some ways, and so I just kind of wasn't really blown away by them as something that was completely different and something that I needed to switch all my rods out for. So I really hadn't fished many of them except for the 9-foot 9-inch models, which I'll talk about here in a little bit as well. But as a result, I haven't, talked about them a whole lot over the last few years, and I kind of regret that a little bit now, because after refishing them, or actually being able to fish them and reflex testing them against a whole bunch of rods in the shop, I've found that they stack up very well, and that they're right up there with a lot of the top tier rods that I've fished. So in this review, that's what we're going to be covering. We're going to be covering the Ultralite LL series. Some of you may know that these rods are designed by Howard Croston, and Howard has been a long time facet in the competitive fly fishing world, fishing for the English fly fishing team. And Howard was the world champion back in 2019. So he knows a thing or two about fishing. And I got to fish with Howard for a week, kind of stay at least in the same place with Howard for a week after the championship, because we were hosted by the Inland Fisheries Service and the Tourist Board for an extra week of fishing after the championship that year. So we stayed at this cool little place where the Inland Fisheries Service has a trap up on the highlands of Tasmania, and just kind of fished some of the lakes and the rivers around. And Howard had these rods in their prototype form, or I think the final prototypes that he was fishing during the championships. And so he used them during his river sessions there, and I got to flex them while we were staying there, but unfortunately I didn't get to fish them. So maybe if I had, I would have also been a little more keen on them when they first came out. In total, there are 8 models in this series of rods. There are 2 9-foot 2-inch models, which we don't have in the shop, so I haven't flexed them, I haven't fished them, and so they're not going to be part of this review. But there are 2 kind of mid-length models, 9-foot 9-inch rods that were meant as kind of crossover do-it-all rods. There's a 3-weight and a 4-weight in that length, and then the first kind of Euro nymphing specific model is a 10-foot 2-inch 2-weight. Then there's a 10-foot 8-inch 0 2-weight, a 10-foot 8-inch 3-weight, and then the longest one of the group is the 11-foot 2-inch 2-weight. All right, let's first go over some of the overall characteristics of this rod series, aesthetically, some of the component choices, things like that. The rods have sort of a lightly sanded finish, so they just took the edges off of the wraps of carbon. They didn't fully sand them down so they're smooth. So they have little ridges that are meant to kind of prevent microleaders from sticking to the rod. I've found that that doesn't really help. I've talked to Howard about it, and he's found that it doesn't help a lot either. So if you really want to fish these rods with microleaders and not have them stick when they're wet, you still have to wrap them with mono like I've showed in a previous video. But the finish does give them a really attractive look. You get just the slightest hint of the actual wraps of carbon because the finish is also translucent. You can see through it to the carbon below, but it is a nice glossy brown finish. Like most Hardy rods, they spared no expense on the rod tube and the rod socks and all the other appointments. The rods also come with inserts for the female ends of the ferrules, kind of like ferrule protectors when they're in the rod tube. I've personally never found the need for a ferrule insert on any other rod. I've never really crushed the female ends of ferrules typically in any of my rod tubes. So this is just sort of an aesthetic thing if you ask me. It is classy looking, but not necessarily functionally useful for me at least. So I don't even use the inserts after when I put the rods away. They've stayed in the rod socks. It's just one extra step to breaking down the rod that I don't want to have to worry about. But if you like that little touch, then I'm sure you'll be happy with the ferrule inserts that come with the rods. Speaking of the ferrules specifically, some people have thought they were spigot ferrules, which you might find on a fiberglass or a cane rod, but they are standard over-under carbon ferrules that are just part of the blank. But the male end has been sanded and left bare, so it kind of gives that spigot ferrule look, but also that bare carbon makes it so that it seats into that female end and stays pretty secure. I would say straight out of the rod tube without wax or anything like that. These ferrules probably fit and stay fit snugly, more so than a lot of rods I've tried. These rods come with pretty classy looking reel seats. They fit most reels very snugly. Sometimes I would say maybe a little bit too snug. I have a couple of reels that I've used on my 9-foot 9-inch model specifically, and I misaligned the dot and the little number on the back of the reel seat once or twice. Didn't pay very close attention. I could still get the reel seat over the reel foot, even when they were misaligned, but then I could not get them off. And I had a very difficult time when I was packing for a world championship once, where I had left a reel on my 9-foot 9-inch 4-weight for months, because I just tend to leave my rods that I fish a lot rigged in my garage, and so I hadn't really paid attention to it. And then when it came time to get it off, I had a very hard time getting it off. So make sure when you're putting the reel on these rods that you align that alignment dot and the little number that comes on the back of the reel seat. And then that way, when you open up the reel seat, unscrew the nut on it, you can usually wiggle that reel enough to get it loose again. And then I normally use my fingers to pull that bottom cap that fits over the reel foot off, instead of just continuing to wiggle the reel, because I haven't found I can get them loose enough like I do on other rods with that method. Going further into those reel seats, the shorter models, the 9-foot 2-inchers and the 9-foot 9-inch models, they have standard up-locking reel seats. Then when you get into the longer models, any of the models over 10 feet, they have down-locking reel seats made to help with balancing with less weight. Those down-locking reel seats also have a fighting butt with a nice cork fighting butt that has the Hardy logo printed on the bottom of them. So nice classy look there. When it comes to the guides, Howard chose recoil nickel titanium guides for both the single foot guides and the last two snake guides. And those last two snake guides, most people would probably be familiar with it by now, but they tend to be chosen on the tips of Euro nymphing rods to help reduce the number of times you might have a very fine leader wrapped around the rod tip. And if you do get that leader wrapped around it, then it's easier to have the leader slough off those snake guides than it is if they get wound around the base of a single foot guide. One aspect that a lot of people are concerned about when it comes to nymphing rods is the distance from the handle to the first stripping guide. We measured all of the longer Euro nymphing models from the handle to the first stripping guide, and they were about 14 inches in that gap. That's a kind of standard, I guess, length for in between the handle and the first stripping guide. Real similar to most of the Contact 2 rods, which were somewhere between 13 and 14 and a half, depending upon the model. Also similar to the Diamondback Ideal nymph rods, which were 14 and a half inches. So they kind of fit in that common distance bracket, but they're not as short as some rods like the Adams XTZ or the Syndicate Reaver. They had distances like on the Reaver that were 5 1/4 on the longest 11-foot model, and they're around 10 inches on that Adams XTZ. So if you're worried about having sag in your Euro line or in your leader between your hand and the first stripping guide, then you might have a little more sag with these rods than you would with some of those other rods that have the stripping guide closer to your hand. Now that we've covered a little bit of an overview of the rod series, what they look like, some of the component choices, things like that, let's actually get into the specific models and talk about their flex profiles and their various performance metrics. Let me first mention one thing though. Earlier this week, I shared some rod flex photos that I'd taken when comparing one of these rods to several others, and we're going to run you through quite a few comparisons for the longer Euro nymphing models. But I had a lot of comments on my Instagram reel saying that, and on Facebook saying that I'd basically been doing this wrong and I should be doing, or I should be using a deflection board and the common sense protocol. For those of you who don't know much about it, I'm not going to go deeply into it, but the common sense protocol is a way of evaluating rods with a deflection board and a specific set of weights, using actually pennies, which is why they call it the common sense protocol. Using that protocol, you can get specific metrics like the true line weight of the rod, and it describes the action through the angle of the tip as it comes in to a measuring device, things like that. It's useful for getting specific numbers that describe the rod. And for a rod builder or somebody designing rods, maybe you can get some extra benefit out of those specific numbers that help you maybe tweak some things. For me personally, I've seen quite a few rods in the past that I've used that had very similar numbers when they came out of the common sense evaluation protocol, but they actually fished really different when I got them on the water, or they cast really different. So the common sense protocol for me, while it may have some useful quantitative metrics that you can use to describe the rods, I'm much more likely to decide between two rods when I can feel the qualitative differences between them. And for me, I can usually compare rods best through just head-to-head flex tests where I have them both in hand. And like I've shared in a previous video that's all about how I choose a nymphing rod, or how you could choose your own nymphing rod, I compare them head-to-head with a vertical flex test. And then what we've done in this video is I've done that process, I've gone through that process on a bunch of rods, and then we've taken slow motion videography. I've freeze framed the flex points at their deepest flex, and then I'm able to match them up in Photoshop so you see the various curves, the flex curves, in comparing those two rods. And then on top of that, I have the feeling of swing weight, which is just that feeling of inertia when you start and stop the rod. If it feels heavier to start and stop moving, then it's got higher swing weight than another rod. And then I'm able to watch and feel how long it takes for a rod to go from flexed to reducing that oscillation back to its original position, just kind of a neutral position. That's the recovery speed. And while I don't have quantitative numbers for each of these rod comparisons, simply because it is an in-hand test that I don't have measuring devices for, the differences are tangible and they're real and I can feel them. So any of the things that I described in this video, I've done through those flex tests. Whether it's as helpful to you as the common sense protocol is up to you. Like I've said in a previous video, I'm not here to convert you to my tribe. I'm just trying to help offer some advice based on my experience with these rods and comparing other rods that might help you decide which one you might want to buy down the road. Let's first start with the 9-foot 9-inch 3-weight. This is actually the first rod I tried and fished out of the series. I got it originally as a dedicated dry fly rod. I was mainly wanting it to fish ultra long leaders with finesse presentations. I ended up finding that it was a little bit too soft for my liking. It's got a fairly soft tip and third section on it, and it would load easier as a result, but for me, I found that I lost loop control because it was a little too soft. And even when I matched it up with a very delicate dry fly taper and underloaded it, I still found that the rod loaded a little too deep for me, and it led to undulations in my loop and a little bit less accuracy. As a result, I tried the 9-foot 9-inch 4-weight, which is kind of on the other end of the spectrum. It's quite a stiff rod. You can really see that. It's much stiffer overall, but especially in that third and fourth section. And once I put a Airflow tactical taper in a 2-weight, so a really low grain weight dry fly specific line with a very long leader, about 19.5 feet, since it's twice the length of that 9-foot 9-inch rod. And that's the rule that we have to stick to in competitions. So I pair it with that really low grain weight line, a really long leader, and I'm able to manipulate my casts much easier with the 4-weight without forming those inaccuracies. And I can do a lot with this rod that I haven't been able to do with really any other dry fly rod. So the 9-foot 9-inch 4-weight has become my primary dry fly rod. I really like it. It's great as an all-around dry fly rod for me with finesse type dry fly techniques, but you could put a standard 4-weight line on it with small to medium size foam terrestrial and it would cast that just fine. And you could also use that same line with a light to medium weight indicator rig, and it would probably still perform quite well for that as well. So I think between these two, medium length models, the 9 foot 9 inch models, the 4-weight is a little more versatile, quite a bit more versatile if you ask me. There are folks who prefer to get their delicacy in dry fly fishing through a soft rod and then lower line speed as a result and have a more relaxed casting stroke. For those anglers, if that happens to be you, then the 9 foot 9 inch 3-weight might be a better choice for you. I also think if you're gonna cross over to Euro nymphing, the 9 foot 9 inch 3-weight would load easier with lighter rigs. The 4-weight is a pretty stiff rod, so it doesn't load that easily if you were to take a light Euro nymph rig and try and fish it. But it's a more versatile rod for those other methods like I talk about. I know a lot of folks are always looking for that do-it-all rod. Between these two models, you may have to make a decision that fits your casting style and the rigs that you expect to fish the most. But for me, the 9 foot 9 inch 4-weight has been my favorite out of the two. One thing I forgot to add earlier, the balance point on the 9 foot 9 inch 3-weight is only 4.7 ounces. A regular dry fly line is going to take up, quite a bit more weight than a Euro line. So really most reels are probably going to balance the 9 foot 9 inch 3-weight pretty well. The balance point for the 9 foot 9 inch 4-weight came in at 6.1 ounces. That's a lot heavier than the 9 foot 9 inch 3-weight, so you can see it's a little more robust in its construction on the blank and probably the guides as well. So you need a little more weight to counterbalance it. Because of that up-locking reel seat that the 9 foot 9 inch 4-weight has, it actually needs almost as much weight as a lot of the 10 foot 8 inch models. So factor that into your reel choice if you go to purchase this rod. I haven't really noticed an issue with mine, but I fish a Poe full gore size 1, which is a fairly light reel for semi-auto, but by the time I add that 2-weight forward line on there, it balances it out just fine. All right, now let's move on to a review of the 10 foot 2 inch 2-weight. Now the first thing to notice when we go through all the review rods, pretty much all the review rods are 10 feet long. So they're 2 inches shorter, which might not sound like much, but it does make a difference. It naturally skews the swing weight in favor of those shorter rods and the recovery speed in favor of those shorter rods, because longer rods tend to have more swing weight and recover more slowly. So if the 10 foot 2 inch 2-weight can keep up with those shorter rods in terms of that swing weight and recovery speed, it just shows that it's designed really well and performs really well. This rod has been probably my favorite as far as the most fun rod to fish out of the Ultralite LL series when it comes to nymphing. I've fished it quite a bit over the last couple months on smaller water. I have a lot of tributary streams to some larger rivers around me, and this rod has been a lot of fun on those smaller waters. I've found that it loads really well with lighter rigs, so I can take a single fly rig with only a 2.3 mil bead or even a 2 millimeter in some shallow pocket water or shallow flats, and it'll still load the rod. I can still fire a cast with a micro leader pretty far with light weights and a single fly at that distance, and it makes a really fun rod for slightly heavier rigs, nice small to medium sized fish. It really lets them show off, and it still punches a dry dropper on a Euro leader fairly well also. It's been a great all-around rod, especially for those small waters where maybe it lacks a little bit is in the authority to really fight a large fish. I hooked frankly a giant brown trout yesterday in a small river, a fish that I wasn't expecting. I was also fishing 7X tippet, so that certainly had a lot to do with it. I was able to keep from breaking that fish off because of the cushion in the 10 foot 2 inch 2-weight, but given that small tippet and the lack of kind of power and authority in the lower half of this rod compared to some of the other models anyway, eventually that fish put me into a stick pile and I said goodbye. It's not the greatest big fish rod in the world, just like all of these 10 foot 2-weight models or soft 3-weight models that I'm going to talk about, but it's really fun as a rod if you just happen to have a lot of small to medium sized rivers where you don't necessarily need a ton of reach compared to a large river, and if you have small to medium sized trout around where you want to make sure that you keep them on the line but also give them a chance to show themselves off, the 10 foot 2 inch 2-weight is the perfect rod for that. Let's move to some direct head-to-head comparisons now. Let's start with the Hardy, the 10 foot 2 inch 2-weight against the Thomas & Thomas Contact 2 in a 10 foot 2-weight. These are kind of both premium rods, pretty much same price, very similar in their flex profile. The Hardy was just slightly softer in the center of the rod, but also slightly stiffer in the tip. When it comes to swing weight, given the little bit extra length, I would expect a little more swing weight in the Hardy, and it did have just a little bit more. You can feel that it just has a smidge more swing weight, not a lot though. And the recovery speed is just slightly better on the Contact 2 as well, either partly as a result of the flex profile or that slightly extra swing weight. But remember, these aren't the exact same length rods, so it's not an entire apples to apples comparison. They're both excellent rods, and the Hardy stacks up really well with the Contact 2 and the 10-foot 2.8. I've found pretty much similar uses for them because they don't have a lot of difference in power or recovery speed. They both cast very accurately and load well with light rigs when you're out on the water. And I found these rods to be pretty interchangeable, and I've really enjoyed having them both back out and comparing them on the stream over the last couple months. Let's now move to the 10-foot 3-weight Contact 2 versus the Hardy 10-foot 2-inch 2.8. As you might expect, given the labeled weight differences, the Contact 2 was slightly stiffer in the butt and center third of the rod, but it was actually fairly similar in the last half of the rod, or the last third of the rod. As a result, given that extra stiffness, the Contact 2 and the 10-foot 3-weight does recover just slightly faster, but their swing weights were pretty darn similar. Now, given that difference in flex profile, not much again, but just a little more power in that Contact 2 10-foot 3-weight. So it has a little more authority to set hooks and maybe land larger fish, but it doesn't load quite as easily with lighter rigs. So factor that into your comparison of these rods. All right, now let's compare the Diamondback 10-foot 1-weight versus the Hardy 10-foot 2-inch 2.8. These rods were quite a bit different. They both have similar flex profiles up through about the center. So both similar in terms of strength down low in that butt section. And that's pretty typical of a lot of the Diamondback rods. They retain that stiff butt section to help with setting the hook and fighting larger fish. But in this 10-foot 1-weight, it's considerably softer in the upper half of the rod than the Hardy 10-foot 2-inch 2.8, which you would hope given their intended design and their labeled weight difference. The 10-foot 1-weight Diamondback definitely lows easier with lighter flies as a result of that soft tip, but it recovers slower as well. You get better recovery speed on the Hardy. Swing weights were pretty similar. They were hard to separate. The differences between these two rods were pretty much as I expected, with the swing weights being similar and the recovery speed being better on the Hardy given its extra stiffness. Deciding between these two rods, they are pretty different rods. If you really like to fish the lightest possible rigs and the lightest possible tippet a lot, and you don't run into a lot of really large fish or fish a lot of heavy current, things like that, the 1-weight Diamondback is designed specifically for that, for the small fly, light fly, finesse enthusiast, Euro nympher. The Hardy's a little more capable all around if you happen to be fishing a variety of waters with a variety of water types and sizes of fish and weights of rigs. The next comparison is of the Diamondback 10-foot 2.8 versus the Hardy 10-foot 2-inch 2.8. The Diamondback was a little bit stiffer in the lower half of the rod, but then also a little bit softer in the upper third, especially of the rod. So it has a little bit softer tip and a little bit more stiffness down low than the Hardy does. The one thing I've noticed between these two rods is the Hardy loads maybe just a little bit easier with lighter rigs. I think it's because it recruits that center third of the rod just a little bit more than the Diamondback 10-foot 2.8 does. Recovery speeds were pretty similar between these two rods, maybe just a little bit faster for the Hardy, and swing weights were also pretty similar. There wasn't a huge difference between them, but I felt like the Diamondback maybe had just a smidge more. The next comparison is the Hardy 10-foot 2-inch 2.8 with the Syndicate Reaver. And we sold our last 10-foot 2.8 Reaver just before I shot this video, so I didn't get a chance to use it in the reviews, and they were back ordered, so I couldn't get one in time to do a comparison. But we did include the 10-foot 3-weight Reaver. In general, the Syndicate rods are considerably softer than a lot of the other Euro rods on the market, so you'll see that in this flex profile as well. Really, the Reaver is just softer pretty much throughout. They have maybe similar flex profiles for the bottom quarter of the rod, but then there's considerably more deflection and flex in that Reaver than there is in the Hardy 10-foot 2-inch 2.8. The swing weight is maybe just a little bit lower on the Reaver than it is on the Hardy, but you actually expect that with really soft rods because more of the rod is flexing towards you and not staying away from you when you do those flex tests. But the recovery speed was noticeably quicker on the Hardy, which you would also expect given their stiffness differences. I haven't fished the Reaver myself, so I can't really offer you an on-the-water comparison between these two rods, but I would expect the difference to be kind of similar to the 10-foot one-weight Diamondback versus the Hardy 10-foot 2-inch 2-weight. I would expect, you know, the Reaver to load very easily with light rigs, but probably lack some authority to set the hook in deep or heavy water and to fight larger fish. I would also expect that increased recovery speed, given the stiffer flex profile of the Hardy. I would expect it to be a little more accurate at casting rigs, especially into tight pockets or into wind. The next comparison is with the Solderini Hydropsyche Tournament 10-foot 2 3-weight. A little bit of a mouthful there. This is a very similar comparison in terms of the flex profile. They had nearly identical flex profiles until the tip, where the Solderini had just a little bit softer tip. Recovery speed was good on both rods, maybe a little more crisp on the Solderini, and swing weight was a little bit lower on the Solderini as well. The Solderini rods in general in this lineup of rods, though, are kind of top performers in swing weight. They really have very low swing weight and good recovery speed. One difference between these two rods, the Solderini's first stripping guide is a full 19 inches from the handle on this specific model in the 10-footers. Not in their longer rods in this range, but in the 10-footers, it's pretty far from that handle. So I would expect a little more sag in your Euro nymph line or your leader between your hand and that first stripping guide in the Solderini. I would expect more sag there than I would with the Hardy that has its first stripping guide, as I already covered, at about 14 inches from your handle. I would say that the Hardy is more aesthetically appealing than the Solderini. The Solderini rod is really focused more on performance and not on all the aesthetic accoutrement, basically. And it's an unsanded, unfinished blank, which I personally find is fine. But I would say, you know, if you're looking for a more beautiful rod, the Hardy is a better choice between these two rods as well. Our next comparison is the Hardy 10-foot 2-inch 2-weight versus the Adams XTZ 10-foot 2-weight. If you look at the flex profiles, they look very similar. It doesn't show as well on the flex profile, but under repeated flexing and fishing, I would say the XTZ acts or feels just a little bit stiffer in the center half of the rod, or the center third of the rod anyway, and the Hardy loads just a little bit easier with lighter rigs, but there's really not a large difference between them. Recovery speed's pretty similar. Swing weight overall feels pretty similar, maybe a little less on the Hardy actually than the Adams, but they're hard to separate there. The main difference between these two rods is obviously that the Adams has the carbon handle grip, which we've talked about this rod in a previous review, so you can watch that review, which I've linked below if you want to see the full breakdown on the Adams XT. But the Adams has that carbon grip to try and get you some added tactile sensitivity, so you'll either love or hate that grip, whereas the Hardy has a standard cork grip. So that'll probably be the main deciding factor between these two rods of which one you pick, since the rest of their performance is fairly similar. The next comparison we have is against the Hardy 10-foot 2-inch 2-weight versus the Sage ESN 10-foot 2-weight. Now the Sage has been around even 3 years longer than the Hardy, so there's a few design concepts on it, I would say, that probably they could use an update. This specific rod, the 10-foot 2-weight, is probably the softest rod that we saw on Flex. The 10-foot 2-weight Sage was considerably softer pretty much through the final 2/3 of the rod than the Hardy is. If you look at the comparisons, there's a much steeper deflection on the 10-foot 2/8 in the Sage, and also the tip is extremely soft as well. You'll notice it actually curves back towards me in the Flex comparison. That's real. That wasn't made up. When you do a Flex comparison with that rod, it is so soft that that tip does curl back towards you. As a result, the outcome was pretty expected. The ESN and the 10-foot 2/8 did have really low swing weight. It is a nice light rod when you flex, you know, start and stop the flex or you cast it, but the recovery speed is a lot slower than the Hardy is. When I've fished that ESN in the past, I found that I was less accurate with that rod than I would be with other rods, and I had a hard time adjusting my casting rhythm. I really had to slow down with that 2/8 ESN to get my flies to go where I wanted them to, and especially if it got windy, I found I was in trouble. So I think the Hardy 2/8 is definitely a better all-around rod between the two of them, and still has enough softness to protect tippet. That's really, I think, what this the ESN was getting at here. It is a tool for maximizing tipper protection and really loading with light flies, but I think it suffers in its all-around usage as a result. The other main difference between these rods is the spacing to that first stripping guide. The Sage ESNs have really high first stripping guides. The 10-foot models were at 21 inches, and the 10.5 foot 3-weight was at 22 inches to that first stripping guide. So there's a lot of distance in between there where you can have sag in between your hand and that first stripping guide on the ESN. Moving on to the next comparison, we have the Sage ESN 10-foot 3-weight versus the Hardy Ultralite LL 10-foot 2-inch 2-weight. And in this one, you'll see that the flex comparison is a little closer than when we compared the 10-foot 2-weight ESN to this Hardy. Through about 2/3 of the rod blanks, their flexes are pretty similar. But then the ESN, once again, is really quite soft in the tip. And so soft, once again, that tip actually starts to curve back towards you. A phenomenon that I was noticing when I was doing these flex tests with these 10-foot ESN models was that the tip is so soft that the tip really lags behind the rest of the rod, and you get a feeling of, the only thing I could think of was tip kick. That curve that you see, that extra curve in the tip, it's basically because put it on flex, the rest of the rod starts to recover, but the tip is still kind of coming down, and the tip, as a result, curves back towards you. And you really feel that oscillation, that hard kick at the end when you make a flex test with those ESNs. The result is basically really slow recovery speed. That's what you're feeling there. It's just accentuated more than some of the other models that I tested. When I've casted both of these rods, the Hardy has recovery rhythm that fits my casting rhythm better, where I can feel the upper half of the rod loading at the timing that I want. And on the Sage, I feel like the tip just lags behind the rest of the rod enough that I had a hard time forming a timing pattern in my own casting to reach the accuracy that I'm after. And once again, the stripping guide is quite a bit higher on the ESN than it is on the Hardy. It's the same 21 inches from that handle to the stripping guide on the 10-foot 3-weight Sage ESN, whereas it's 14 inches on the Hardy. The last comparison we're going to make with the 10-foot 2-inch 2-weight Hardy Ultralite LL is with the new Orvis Helios. They don't call it a Helios 4, but it's the 4th generation Helios, and in the 10-foot 3-weight Helios. I haven't had a chance to fish the Helios yet, so I can't give you an on-the-water comparison in how they cast. But in the flex test comparison, the Helios definitely is softer in the upper half of the rod, especially the last third. The tip isn't quite as soft, though, as those 10-foot ESN models we were talking about. So the tip recovery was faster on the Orvis. Overall recovery was still a little bit slower, given that softer flex profile. Still a little bit slower than the Hardy is, but for being as soft as it is, the Helios does recover quickly, and the swing weight was a little bit lower than the Hardy on test. One other point of comparison, when I measured it, the Helios's first stripping guide was 16 inches from the handle, so it's a few inches further away from your hand than that Hardy's going to be. If I were to remake the Helios myself, I probably would have tried to refit the guide spacing a little bit differently to get that stripping guide lower down on that first section. All right, let's move on to the 10-foot 8-inch 028. Before I get into the teeth of this one balanced out with a minimum balance weight of 5.8 ounces. So you're gonna need a reel that's at least 4.5 ounces to balance this rod by the time you add line, Euro nymphing line at least, and backing. So factor that into any reel purchase that you might have. As with any of these rods, I tend to like maybe even a little bit more than the minimum balance weight, so they balance even deeper into the cork. So any reel that's heavier than that 4.5 ounces is still gonna work great. You just don't wanna go under that amount. When it comes to the 10-foot 8-inch 028, I think the main issue with this rod is just how it's labeled a 028. I think that this rod is a great all-around nymphing rod. It performs really similar to a lot of my other favorite kind of all-around longer length Euro nymphing rods, as we'll see in the direct head-to-head comparisons that I'm going to cover for this rod in just a minute. But that 02 label, I think, is a little misleading for most folks. Either they think it's really going to be flexible, has no power, and they don't want to get it because they feel like they want an all-around Euro nymphing rod and this rod isn't going to be powerful enough for them. Or they buy it thinking, I want that, you know, soft, deep flexing rod with a lot of tipper protection that'll load with light flies, and they get it and they're like, oh, well, this is a lot like the 3-weight that I might already have. So I just think it's a labeling issue on this rod. I don't think it should be labeled a 0.2 weight. To me, this rod's much closer to basically about a 3-weight, or at least a 2.75 when you compare it to other Euro nymphing rods in this length category. We'll factor that into your purchase decision if you're looking at this rod. This issue highlights the conundrum of continuing to use the AFTMA line weight designations for labeling line weights on Euro nymphing rods. They're designed a fair bit differently from traditional, overhead casting rods. As a result, some rod manufacturers tend to label their Euro nymphing rods more based on how the tip flexes, and others might label it based on how the rest of the rod flexes, that lower half of the rod. But in the end, a 3-weight isn't necessarily a 3-weight, isn't necessarily a 3-weight when it comes to Euro nymphing rods. There's at least a lot more variability in there. Let's move on to our flex comparisons, these direct head-to-head comparisons for the 10-foot 8-inch 0.2 weight Hardy versus a few other rods. Let's start with the Contact 2 10-foot 9-inch 3-weight. So if you've watched the review I have on the Contact 2 series, you'll know this is a rod that I've been fishing for a long time. I've been fishing the 10-foot 9-inch Contact 2 in that 3-weight since 2019 when it came out, and I still think it's almost been like sort of the standard rod model for me in these mid-length rods, where it's what I compare a lot of other rods to. And the Hardy in the 10-foot 8-inch 0.2 weight stacks up really well against the 10-foot 9-inch 3-weight Contact 2. If you look, their flex profiles are really quite similar. Through about 3/4 of the rod, they're almost identical. But the Hardy has just a little bit softer tip, that you don't see really much deviation in the flex profile till that softer tip. So maybe that's where the 0.2 weight designation ends up coming from. But if you look at the overall power profile of these rods, there's similar amount of power to set the hook, to fight fish. The Hardy maybe just has a little bit extra tippet protection, but with that softer tip, maybe a little bit slower recovery, just a little bit, and as a result, it's maybe slightly less accurate. Their swing weights are pretty similar. Really, there wasn't much difference when testing their swing weights between these two rods. The Hardy, because of that softer tip, maybe loads just a little bit easier with lighter rigs once again. So if you're fishing a lot of single fly rigs, especially beads smaller than 2.8 millimeters, maybe there's a little bit of an advantage with the Hardy there, but maybe a little bit of an accuracy advantage with the Contact 2 if you're trying to punch slightly heavier rigs into wind especially. But the reality is these rods have very similar performance metrics, and there's not a lot to separate them. So they end up being both really great all-around nymphing rods, and I would be very happy to fish the Hardy 0.2 weight in the same situations I would fish that Contact 2 10-foot 9-inch 3-weight. All right, now we're going to look at the comparison between the 10-foot 8-inch 0.2 weight Hardy and the Contact 2 in the 10-foot 9-inch 2-weight. You'll see that in the lower half of these rods, the flex profile is pretty similar. Through the butt and second section, there's not a lot of difference. The 10-foot 9-inch 2-weight Contact 2 is considerably softer in that upper half of the rod. The swing weight of that Contact 2 is lower, and it's a pretty impressively low swing weight for that length of rod. The stiffness profile differences between them would suggest that the Hardy should have faster recovery speed, and that's exactly what comes out of these rods. The Hardy is noticeably quicker to recover. There's a fair bit more oscillation in that upper half of the Contact 2 and the 2-weight. And as a result, I've had a fair bit of accuracy difference between these two rods, specifically when I'm casting in windy conditions. I've really had to slow down my casting pause, wait a lot longer on the back cast, and for my rig to turn over ways when I'm fishing the Contact 2 and the 2-weight. And so I can get into a slightly more aggressive, kind of punchy style into the wind with the Hardy, where I don't suffer a real reduction in accuracy that I might with the 2-weight in the Contact 2. That extra softness in the upper section of the Contact 2 also doesn't lend it to setting the hook in really deep and heavy water as much, and it tends to overload, I would say, with really large beads, 4mm beads, things like that. Whereas the Hardy can still handle those. I would say in general, the Hardy ends up being a better all-around nymphing rod between these two rods, which is why I think it really is a better comparison to compare the Hardy 0.2 weight to that Contact 2 10-foot 9-inch 3-weight. Between these two rods, in the end, if you're looking for a rod that has max tippet protection. It'll really protect fine tippets, and it'll load easy with really light rigs, but it still has that long length, 10.5 feet or longer. Then the Contact 2 and a 2.8 is a good choice. But if you want a better all-around nymphing rod, has a little more capability if you happen to run into larger fish, or you need to set the hook in really deep, heavy water on large rivers, or if you need to sling some 4mm beads around, then the Hardy and the 10-foot 8-inch 0.28 would be my pick between these two rods. The next comparison we're gonna make is between the Hardy 10-foot 8-inch 0.28 and the Diamondback Ideal Nymph in the 10-foot 10-inch 2.8. Now again, notice that the Ideal Nymph rod here is a couple inches longer, so those tendencies to lower recovery speed and more swing weight and longer rods are going to play into this comparison, given that they're not exactly the same length. The flex profiles between these two rods were really quite different. It's a similar comparison to the one we were just talking about with the Contact 2 and the 10-foot 9-inch 2.8. They have similar flex profiles in the lower halves of the rod. From then on out, the Diamondback and the 10-foot 2-inch 2.8 is a fair bit softer. For me, between these two rods, the Hardy came out a little bit better in terms of swing weight, but the recovery speed difference is pretty wide. The recovery on the Hardy definitely is faster, but once again, you would expect that given that it has a stiffer flex profile and it's a little bit shorter rod. I find that I'm a little more accurate with the Hardy in this instance, but that Diamondback does protect tippet better because of that softer upper half of the rod. And it does load easy, not only with light rigs, but kind of under its own mass. Our next comparison is another mouthful. We're gonna look at the 10-foot 6-inch 2.3 weight in the Solderini Hydropsyche Tournament rod versus the Hardy Ultralite LL 10-foot 8-inch 0.28. Now this comparison was another interesting one. These rods had pretty similar flex profiles up until about 3/4 of the way through the rod, and then the tip on the Solderini is a fair bit softer than the Hardy. The Solderini, like the rest of their rods in the tournament lineup, has really low swing weight. Again, this rod probably had the lowest swing weight of any in this mid-length test group. It is a couple inches shorter though, so factor that into it. You would expect it to have less swing weight at a shorter length. It also has really fast recovery speed, which again, it should be better in a shorter length than a longer rod in terms of recovery speed, but the Hydropsyche Tournament did have better swing weight and better recovery speed than the Hardy in this case. I've fished both of these rods a fair bit recently. I would say that their flex profile is pretty indicative of their strengths and weaknesses. The Solderini does load quite easily with light rigs. It's got that nice soft tip, so you can ping a single 2.3 or 2.8 millimeter bead out there pretty easily, but it lacks maybe a little bit of authority when you're setting the hook in really deep water. And if you're throwing something like a mop with a 4mm bead that's soaked up a lot of water, it tends to fold a little bit and not cast as accurately with those really heavy rigs. The Solderini does maybe keep really small fish on the line a little bit easier. It's got a lot of flex, but also quick recovery in that tip, so you're less likely to drop or bounce fish is what a lot of competitors would say when it comes to landing those smaller fish. But that may not matter to you if you're not worried about scoring fish on the smaller end of things in your own recreational fishing. But that Hardy may be still the better choice as an all-around nymphing rod if you're looking for a €1 nymphing rod to do it all, because it does have a little more fighting power for larger fish once again, and hook setting power for that deep heavy water. And if you do have to turn to heavier rigs, the Hardy in the 10-foot 8-inch 0.2 weight does cast those a little bit more accurately than the Solderini will. Unlike in the 10-foot models, the Hydropsyche Tournament, the stripping guide is noticeably closer. So on the 10.5-foot model, the stripping guide is only about 10 or 10.25 inches from the handle. So there aren't the sag issues between the hand and the first stripping guide with the 10.5-foot Hydropsyche Tournament that you would find on the shorter 10-foot models where they were 19 inches away. The next comparison is in the Adams XTZ 10.5-foot 2.8 versus the Hardy 10-foot 8-inch 0.2 weight Ultralite LL. And just like in the shorter comparison between these two model lineups, the flex profiles once again are really similar. When you overlay that XTZ flex profile with the Hardy flex profile, there's not a lot of separation here. The Hardy's maybe just slightly softer in the tip than the XTZ is, but it's very minimally identifiable. So really, there's not a lot of difference between the Adams and the Hardy in this comparison. They have similar recovery speed, similar swing weight. They have similar all-around usage as Euro nymphing rods. They both make great all-around Euro nymphing rods. Really the main difference is just the handle, and you're going to have that carbon handle on the Adams XTZ, which you'll either love or hate, and you have a traditional cork grip on the Hardy. The last comparison for the Hardy Ultralite LL 10-foot 8-inch 0.2 weight is with the Sage ESN in the 10.5-foot 3 weight. I used to own both the 10-foot 3 weight and the 10.5-foot 3 weight in the ESN, but I sold them once the Contact 2s came out, mainly because I liked that flex profile of the Contact 2 more. It just fit me better in my casting style. That's what I saw with these two rods as well. The Hardy is a fair bit stiffer in the upper half of the rod except for the tip. So that's one area of difference in these rods. The Hardy's tip is a little bit softer, mainly I think to add that extra tipper protection. But recovery was definitely crisper with the Hardy, and swing weight was pretty similar, or maybe even a little bit heavier on the ESN than it was on the Hardy. One last point of comparison is that first stripping guide again on the ESN. As a reminder, on this 10.5-foot model, it's 22 inches from the end of the cork to that first stripping guide. It's a lot of distance in between there for a Euro line or a leader to sag. To reiterate again, the Hardy is 14 inches away from the handle on that stripping guide, so there would definitely be less sag in between your fingers and that stripping guide. We're going to move on now to the Hardy Ultralite LL in the 10-foot 8-inch 3 weight. This is a rod that I would classify in that next bracket up of being almost like a trophy trout Euro nymphing rod. It still actually works really well as an all-around nymphing rod, but it does have slightly stiffer third and fourth sections compared to the 0.2 weight. And similar to that 0.2 weight, if you consider that 0.2 weight like a 2.75 or a 3 weight, then I would consider the labeled 3 weight of the 10-foot 8-inch 3 weight more of like a 3.5 or a 3.75, and that bears out in the flex profiles that you'll see in the comparisons here in a minute. The nice thing about this rod, given that it has a little bit more power, that it is a little bit stiffer, it still has really quite low swing weight given its length and the extra power. A lot of the stouter rods that are longer, they end up, you really notice that extra swing weight that they tend to get. In this rod, it still stays fairly low, but there's a lot of hook setting power, a lot of fish fighting power in this rod. I've been able to really turn large fish in heavy currents with this rod, and as I come into the fall and winter, there's 1 or 2 rivers that are not too far away that I tend to fish during the colder months of the year that have really large fish, but they have really heavy flows. I end up fishing really deep rigs with at least one 4 mil bead and often a 2.8 or a 3.3 along with it. Sometimes I'll even have 2 4mm inverting tungsten beads in really heavy flows. And this is a rod that I can see being a great rod for those specific rivers and the fish that I tend to run into there. So if you're looking for a Euro nymphing rod that does have that extra power that maybe you want to jig streamers with to drive those thicker gauge wires home, and you tend to fish heavier rigs a lot, and you tend to run into large fish a lot, or maybe you fish from a boat, this would be a good choice as well to fish from a drift boat like I talked about in our last video. It would be a really good rod for those types of purposes. Doesn't have as much tippet protection as the 0.2 weight, which you would expect. Doesn't load quite as easily as that 0.2 weight, but if you're not as concerned about that and you're more concerned about having that power, that a little extra authority when you need to really land that biggest fish, that trophy fish that you tend to be targeting, then the 10-foot 8-inch 3 weight is a really good choice of blending still a light rod that recovers quick with a rod that can be capable of doing those heavier duty tasks. The minimum balance weight for the 10-foot 8-inch 3 weight came out at 6.1 ounces. Doing the math, you need a reel that's about 5 ounces if you're going to put a standard 100 yards of backing and a Euro nymph line on it. The minimum balance weight for the 10-foot 8-inch 3 weight Hardy came out at about 6.1 ounces. So if I was going to put a Euro nymphing line and backing on, I'd be looking for a reel that's 5 ounces or heavier to balance out this rod. So let's start off with a flex comparison of the Contact 2 10-foot 9-inch 3 weight with this Hardy 10-foot 8-inch 3 weight. Given their labels, you'd expect they'd be real similar, and they are pretty similar overall. There's not a ton of difference. What you'll notice is the sort of the inverse of the comparison with the Hardy and the 0.2 weight. In this comparison, the Hardy and the 3 weight does have a stiffer third and fourth section. Before that, really through the first half of the rod, their flex comparisons are quite similar, but you just notice a little bit of that extra stiffness in the 3 weight Hardy once you get high in the rod. The swing weight is just the tiniest bit heavier on the Hardy and the 3-weight, but there's not a lot of difference there. The recovery speeds are also pretty similar, not a ton of difference there either. In the end, I would probably give the Hardy the edge in terms of just that little bit of extra power between these two rods. You know, the rod I would turn to when I want to go to a river that I know I'm going to run into some large fish and I won't be fishing, you know, smaller than 6X tippet. That would the Hardy and this 3-weight would be a good choice there. But if you need to maybe protect that 7X tippet, or you need to load with a little bit lighter rig, then the Contact 2 10-foot 9-inch 3-weight is I'd give the edge to it in that regard. Now, let's move on to the Hardy in the 10-foot 8-inch 3-weight versus the Contact 2 in the 10-foot 9-inch 4-weight. These rods are pretty similar again until the tip. So flex through about 3/4 of the rod, maybe even a little bit further. These rods are nearly identical. You can't really separate them on the page when I look at the flex profiles, and I didn't really feel that much different through 3/4 of the rod when I was flexing them either. But once you get to that curves, there's a little more of an inflection point there, and the Contact 2 in the 4-weight stays a fair bit stiffer. The Hardy does have a little bit less swing weight in this comparison than the Contact 2 in the 4-weight. And recovery speed was maybe a smidge quicker in the 4-weight with that stiffer tip of the Contact 2, but not a lot of difference between them in you know, swing weight and recovery speed. I would say that these rods both perform well as, you know, larger fish, trophy trout rods. The Diamondback maybe is just a little bit better in terms of the largest trophy trout that you might encounter and driving really large hooks home with that extra stiff tip. But if you want a little bit of a blend of both, the Hardy is probably the better choice as an all-around nymph rod. Okay, now let's look at the Hardy in the 10-foot 8-inch 3-weight versus the Diamondback Ideal Nymph in the 10-foot 10-inch 3-weight. This comparison is pretty similar in overall comparison as the last one we did between these two rod series in the 0-2-weight versus the 2-weight. These rods share pretty similar flex profiles through the bottom half of the rod. They both have pretty stiff butt sections, but you'll notice that the Diamondback gets considerably softer around that center of the rod and definitely has a softer 3rd and 4th section than the Hardy does in the 3-weight. The swing weights are pretty similar between these two rods, maybe a little bit lighter on the Hardy, and the recovery speed is better on the Hardy as well. Again, we're dealing with different flex profiles here, so that would make sense to have faster recovery on the stiffer rod in the Hardy, plus the Hardy's a couple inches shorter, so factor that in again to the differences between these two rods. I've used the Diamondback 3-weight a fair bit for kind of trophy trout applications in the past, and it works really well for those. And the Hardy maybe takes that up just a notch further in terms of, you know, that power for setting the hook on jig streamers or with heavy rigs in heavy water. Once again, all the similar things that I've been talking about. When fishing these two rods, I've found that the Hardy is just a little bit more accurate for me, especially when casting rigs into the wind, when I really have to drive something home to kind of cast against that wind or factor my casting angles into it. Other than that, they have pretty similar authority to set the hook because of that lower half of the rod. The Hardy maybe gives the edge at there, and it gives the edge maybe on fighting larger fish and throwing heavier rigs overall. But the Diamondback, if you still want, you know, that rod that has trophy trout capability but can protect a little bit finer tippet, it's probably a little bit better in that regard because of that extra shock absorption of the softer 3rd and 4th sections. Let's move now to the longest model in the series, the 11-foot 2-inch 2-weight. For those of you who've watched some of my previous reviews, you'll probably know that I don't really like really long rods that much when it comes to Euro nymphing. The extra swing weight and the slower recovery they have tends not to favor me. I'm built like a 12-year-old boy, so I don't really have a ton of brute force to be able to put at bay when I'm fishing longer rods. And in the past, I've noticed a fair bit of fatigue that I get in my forearm when I'm dealing with rods that have really heavy swing weight. In fact, there was about a 3-year period where I battled with tendonitis in some of the earliest Euro nymphing rods that came out that, even though they were 10-foot 4-weights, had a lot of swing weight compared to a lot of our more modern, updated Euro nymphing rods. So I'm pretty sensitive to that metric, once it gets past a certain point, and I don't tend to turn to rods that are 11 feet or over very often unless I really need to reach out and touch a fish in the middle of the river. Predictably, as a result of what I just told you, the 11-foot 2-inch 2-weight is probably my least favorite rod in the Hardy lineup. I don't find it to be a great all-around nymph rod. I took it actually to a pretty small river right at the end of runoff thinking, oh, it'll be a nice rod to really see if I can get to the other side of this river where I might not be able to wade very close right now, even though it's a smaller river. I might not be able to wade over these heavy currents. And I also brought the 10-foot 8-inch 0.2 weight along, and I went back and forth and fished them, in comparison. And I found I was a lot more accurate with the 10-foot 8-inch rod than I was the 11-foot 2-inch rod, and I just enjoyed fishing that shorter rod a lot more. I did have maximum, reach with the 11-foot 2-inch rod, and if you tend to fish from a boat a lot, or you tend to fish only large rivers, or you tend to be, stronger than I am, if you're built a little bit sturdier, then the 11-foot 2-inch rod may be a really good choice for you. It just isn't for me. And that extra swing weight and just sort of the overall weight of the rod and the length itself, it bears out in the minimum balance weight. The minimum balance weight came out at about 7.1 ounces, so you need to be looking for a reel that's about 6 ounces. If you add the backing and the Euro line to it, you need that 6 ounces to balance out this rod. That ends up being a fairly heavy reel, so you'll need to check the metrics on the reels that you might be looking at if you were going to pair one with this rod. Besides, having a reel like the ESN or the Galvin or the Tilt or the Diamondback that have adjustable weights. If you had a reel that wasn't heavy enough, you might also look at adding a couple revolutions of lead golf tape to the arbor before you put your backing on to try and raise that weight to at least that 6 ounces or higher. All right, let's look at some flex comparisons of the 11-foot 2-inch 2.8 Hardy versus a few other rods. We will start again with the Contact 2 in the 11-foot 2-inch 3-weight. What you'll notice is the butt section is just a little bit stiffer on the Contact 2 in this case. But actually, even though it's labeled a 3-weight, the Hardy in the 2-weight is stiffer in the 3rd and 4th sections. Their swing weight was pretty similar and kind of hard to separate for me, and their recovery speed was also pretty similar and hard to separate. If I had to separate these rods, the Contact 2 probably has just a little bit extra tippet protection, and the Hardy, as you might think from the stiffer profile, just a little more authority to set the hook. But they're both rods that are really long, can reach out and get you adrift in the middle of a river a long ways out there, but neither one of them is going to have a lot of tippet protection compared to some of the shorter, softer rods, and both of them are going to have a fair bit of swing weight compared to shorter rods as well. Now let's look at the comparison between the 11-foot 2-inch 2.8 Hardy and the Solerini Hydropsyche Tournament in an 11-foot 2.8. This was a pretty interesting comparison. We just barely got the 11-foot 2.8 Solerinis in the shop about a month before this, and I haven't had a chance to fish one yet. So unfortunately, I can't give you on-the-water comparison like I have with all of the Hardy versus Contact 2 comparisons, for example. But this was a really different comparison in terms of flex profile. The Solerini has one of the flattest flex profiles that I've seen in a Euro nymphing rod. If you look at the difference between these, the Hardy is stiffer in the lower half of the rod. The Solerini is, quite flat and really doesn't have much curve. It kind of gets quite stiff in the center of the rod compared to the Hardy. And then the tip on the Solerini is quite a bit stiffer than the tip on the Hardy. I will tell you in the flex profiles, or in the flex tests, the Solerini did have a less swing weight and it did recover a little bit quicker, but it is also 2 inches shorter. So once again, you would expect better recovery and lower swing weight on a shorter rod. And performance-wise, like I said, I'm not really sure how these would stack up on the water. I can't really tell yet whether that significantly different flex profile in the Solerini is going to be a good or a bad thing when it comes to tippet protection and fish fighting, all those sorts of things. So time's going to tell on this one for me. All right, now let's compare the Adams XTZ 11-foot 2.8 versus the Hardy 11-foot 2-inch 2.8 Ultralite LL. This comparison, the Adams is kind of in between in flex profile versus the last rod we talked about, the Solerini Hydropsyche Tournament. The Adams still has a kind of a flatter flex profile, but it's intermediate, I would say, in between the Hardy and the Solerini. You'll notice that the butt sections are fairly similar. The Hardy is once again stiffer in the center third of the rod, but then the Hardy is softer in the tip of the rod, and the Adams is a bit stiffer. The swing weight of these two rods was quite similar. Not a lot to separate them in terms of that. The recovery speed's probably a little bit higher on the Adams XTZ, but you would expect that with its shorter length and that stiffer tip. Let's look at the Syndicate Reaver in the 11-foot 3-weight versus the Hardy 11-foot 2-inch 2-weight. And really, just like the previous Syndicate comparison, there's a lot of difference in the flex profile here. Syndicate's rods tend to be quite soft overall compared to a lot of other Euro nymphing rods. After the first third of these rods, which were similar, the Syndicate is pretty much softer the whole way through. The last 2/3 is considerably softer than the Hardy in this case. This difference was a pretty good predictor of the swing weight and the recovery speed. The Syndicate did have lower swing weight during the flex test, but the Hardy had faster recovery speed. Once again, I haven't fished the Reaver in the 11-foot 3-weight, so I can't really give you a direct on-the-water comparison on how these rods compare. But given their difference in flex profiles, it'd be probably a similar predictor to some of the other rods that I've looked at that have differences like this. I would expect the Syndicate to load a little bit easier with lighter flies, but also be less accurate if you really need to punch a cast, especially with heavier weight rigs. Okay, we've come to the last head-to-head rod comparison in this video. I must admit, this is a little bit of a project, so thanks for watching if you've gotten all the way to here. This comparison is going to be for the Hardy Ultralite LL 11-foot 2-inch 2-weight versus the new Orvis Helios 11-foot 3-weight in their Helios in the 4th generation. So I have to admit, when we got the Helios in the shop just a couple months ago, I took the 11-foot 3-weight out and flexed it. I also took the 10-foot 3-weight out and flexed it. Those are never comparisons you should make with rods that disparate in length. I was initially pretty impressed and liked the 10-foot 3-weight a lot, and I was initially pretty unimpressed and really didn't like the 11-foot 3-weight. The reality is the 11-foot 3-weight in the Helios is just another 11-foot rod, and so the extra swing weight and slower recovery I was feeling are just, they tend to be characteristics of all longer rods. So when I came back to this head-to-head comparison, the Helios actually fared pretty well. It had maybe just slightly more swing weight than the Hardy does, and I think maybe that's because of that matte paint finish, might add a little bit of weight. But overall, their swing weights were fairly similar. The recovery speed was also pretty similar, maybe a little bit crisper on the Helios, and I think it's just because it had a little bit stiffer tip, as you'll see in the flex comparison. The flex comparison was really quite similar overall, and it's really only those tips that differentiate, with the Hardy starting to curve a little bit and definitely having that softer tip that loads a little easier, and the Helios has a little flatter flex profile with the tip not being quite as soft. But not a ton to separate them in that flex profile. It's pretty similar overall, and I would expect, even though I haven't fished the Helios, I would expect these rods to perform pretty similarly on the water. Put it all together, in summary, after doing all these flex tests and comparisons both on and off the water, I really do like the Hardy Ultralite LL rod series. With all the various models that are in this series, there's something in it for every angler, regardless of the type of fishing you like to do. If you like to do technical dry fly fishing, there's some shorter models for you. If you want a rod that kind of will nymph a little bit, also dry fly a little bit, there's some 9-foot 9-inch models for you, depending upon your casting style and the type of rigs that you like to fish. There's the 10-foot 2-inch 2-weight, which I really love for smaller water, and it's become one of the funnest rods I own to fish. And then, you know, you've got the great all-around models in those 10-foot 8-inch rod lengths as all-around Euro nymphing rods, and that reach out and touch a fish in the river model with the 11-foot 2-inch rod. So depending upon what it is you really want to find in a rod, you'll probably be able to find it in this series of rods. I think they're really nice to look at, they perform well, and they've really risen to right near the top of my favorites that I like to use each day. So if you're looking for that premium rod that gives you not only really good aesthetics, but also excellent performance, the Ultralite LL is a really good choice. And I know that there's probably a model in there that will fit your specific fishing needs and fishing style. And if you have any more questions about that, feel free to send us an email at info@tacticalflyfisher.com, or just use the contact form on our website at tacticalflyfisher.com. And come on over there where we've got whatever you need for your next fishing adventure, whether it's a new Hardy rod, one of the other rods I talked about, or some fly tying or fishing goods will get you geared up and ready to chase those fish this fall and winter. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you stuck around to the end of the video, man, you are a super fan, and I thank you. And if you did like this video, a lot of work went into it, so please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel, and feel free to share it with your friends as well so they have a chance to see it if they're looking at a new rod.